Memorial Day weekend in Ocean City, Maryland is usually defined by noise and color. The boardwalk fills with tourists carrying paper trays of fries. Music spills out of crowded bars. The air smells like salt, sunscreen, and spilled beer. It's the kind of place where people come to forget their problems at least for a few days. For Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, a young couple from Virginia, that weekend was supposed to be exactly that. A short escape. A chance to relax. They checked into their condo, changed clothes, and headed out into the night, blending into the crowd of vacationers, chasing the same simple promise, fun, freedom, and a little bit of joy. They never made it home. That same weekend, another couple was also in Ocean City. Erica and Benjamin Siffre looked from the outside like they had everything figured out. Benjamin was a former Navy SEAL, disciplined, trained, decorated. Erica had once been a college basketball star, known for her intensity and competitiveness. Together they projected the image of confidence, success, and control. But behind that polished exterior, something was deeply wrong. On the evening of May 25th, the two couples crossed paths on a bus heading to Secrets, a popular nightclub. It was a small moment, the kind that happens thousands of times every weekend. Joshua and Martha didn't have exact change for the fare, so they offered to buy Erica and Benjamin a drink instead. It was friendly, casual. By the end of the night, the four were laughing together, sharing rounds, moving through the club as if they'd known each other for years. There was no warning, no sign that anything was about to go terribly wrong. When the night wound down, Erica and Benjamin invited Joshua and Martha back to their penthouse condo at the Rainbow. The offer didn't seem dangerous. It felt like the natural continuation of a fun night, so the couple agreed. That decision sealed their fate. Once inside the condo, the mood shifted. Erica suddenly claimed her purse was missing. She accused Joshua and Martha of stealing it. The accusation wasn't real, it was manufactured. A deliberate lie designed to create confusion and fear. When the couple denied it, things escalated quickly. Voices rose, tension thickened the air. Then a weapon appeared. Joshua and Martha retreated into the bathroom, locking the door behind them. They were trapped. There was nowhere to go. In the early hours of May 26th, shots were fired through the bathroom door. Joshua was hit multiple times. Martha was also struck. By the time the gunfire stopped, both were gone. What happened next revealed a level of cold calculation that stunned investigators. Erica and Benjamin didn't panic. They didn't call for help. Instead, they dismembered the bodies. They placed the remains into trash bags, loaded them into their vehicle, and drove across state lines into Delaware. There they disposed of the bags in commercial dumpsters, scattering evidence across multiple locations. Then, they went shopping. They returned to Ocean City, cleaned the condo, and went outlet shopping as if nothing had happened. In the days that followed, they wore jewelry that belonged to Joshua and Martha. They answered messages. They lived their lives. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were growing desperate. Joshua and Martha hadn't shown up for work. Calls went unanswered. Text messages were ignored. Missing persons reports were filed, and the search began. The case might have dragged on longer, if not for one careless mistake. On May 31st, less than a week after the crime, Erica and Benjamin were caught breaking into a Hooters restaurant in Ocean City. During the arrest, police searched Erica's belongings. Inside, they found something chilling: the driver's licenses of Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. There was no innocent explanation. Under interrogation, Erica confessed, though she attempted to shift much of the blame onto Benjamin. He remained largely silent. Both were charged with first-degree offenses, and because of the intense media attention, their trials were moved to different counties. Benjamin's trial took place in Rockville. Erica's was held in Frederick. In April 2003, Benjamin was convicted of second-degree involvement in Martha Crutchley's death, but acquitted in Joshua Ford's case. He received a 38-year sentence. The judge, disturbed by the brutality of the crime, made a rare request in the file, asking to be personally notified if Benjamin ever became eligible for parole so he could oppose it. Erica's outcome was even more severe. In June 2003, she was convicted of first-degree responsibility for Joshua Ford's death and second-degree responsibility for Martha Crutchley's. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. Years later, both sought parole. Both were denied. Families of the victims appeared before the board to ensure they stayed behind bars. Ocean City moved on, but it never forgot. The Rainbow condo building still stands. Tourists still flood the boardwalk every Memorial Day weekend. But for locals, there's an unspoken awareness, a reminder that sometimes the person laughing next to you at the bar isn't who they appear to be. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley came to Ocean City for joy and relaxation. Instead, they became victims of two people who treated human life as disposable. And this was only the beginning. In October 2002, fear settled over the Washington metropolitan area like a heavy fog. For 3 weeks, ordinary life stopped feeling safe. Pumping gas, walking to a car, mowing a lawn, standing still for even a few seconds suddenly felt dangerous. There was no warning, no argument, no chance to run. Just a sharp crack in the distance and someone collapsing to the ground. The attacks began on October 2nd in Wheaton, Maryland. A man crossing a parking lot was struck by a high-velocity rifle round fired from far away. Within hours, 4 more people were hit, different locations, different victims, no obvious connection. What made it terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the randomness. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Law enforcement scrambled. Roadblocks appeared across major highways. Helicopters hovered low over neighborhoods. Schools locked their doors. Gas stations erected blue tarps so customers could fuel their cars without standing in the open. Parents kept children indoors. Commuters zigzagged through parking lots, afraid to walk in a straight line. An entire region was changing its behavior because someone, somewhere, was watching. Behind the fear were 2 individuals operating with chilling coordination. John Allen Muhammad, a 41-year-old Gulf War veteran, and Lee Boyd Malvo, a 17-year-old teenager from Jamaica. Muhammad had taken Malvo under his wing years earlier, positioning himself as a father figure. But the relationship was deeply manipulative. Muhammad isolated Malvo from his mother, filled his head with distorted beliefs, and trained him to see violence as a means to an end. Together, they had already left a trail of incidents across the country before arriving in the Washington area. Their weapon was a Bushmaster rifle modified for precision. Their vehicle was a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, unremarkable on the outside but transformed into a mobile killing platform. A small firing port had been cut into the trunk. From there, they could strike without being seen. They would park in public areas, climb into the trunk, take aim, and fire. Victims came from every walk of life: a bus driver, a teacher, a retiree, a 3-year-old boy shot outside his school. There was no pattern investigators could rely on, no clear motive, just fear. Then the messages started. Tarot cards were left at scenes scrawled with phrases like "Call me God." Letters demanded money and threatened further violence. The shooters weren't just killing, they were trying to control the narrative to demonstrate power. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Every new attack brought more panic. Every day, without answers, deepened the sense of helplessness. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place. In an earlier incident at a convenience store in Montgomery, Alabama, a fingerprint had been recovered from a magazine left behind. When analysts revisited the evidence and ran it through updated databases, it matched Lee Boyd Malvo. Immigration records led investigators to John Allen Muhammad. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. Ballistics evidence matched Muhammad's rifle. Vehicle registrations pointed to the blue Chevrolet Caprice. On October 24th, a truck driver noticed a car matching the description parked at a rest stop near Myersville, Maryland. Something about it felt wrong. He called 911. Within minutes, police surrounded the vehicle. Inside, Muhammad and Malvo were asleep. There was no dramatic chase, no shootout. They were taken into custody quietly, almost anticlimactically. But what investigators found inside the car was anything but ordinary. The modified rifle, maps with crime scenes marked, detailed notes, the trunk converted into a sniper's nest. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a mobile execution chamber. Prosecutors later argued that Muhammad's ultimate goal wasn't random terror. They believed he was trying to create enough chaos to conceal a personal target, his ex-wife, who lived near the Capitol Beltway. By making the region unsafe for everyone, her death would blend into the pattern. Malvo would later claim that Muhammad had convinced him they were working towards something larger, a plan to extort money, a vision of establishing a compound in Canada where homeless children would be raised and trained under their control. Virginia took the lead in prosecution. John Allen Muhammad was convicted and sentenced to death. He showed no remorse. In November 2009, he was executed by the state of Virginia. Lee Boyd Malvo's case was more complicated. Because of his age at the time of the crimes, he received multiple life sentences rather than capital punishment. In Maryland alone, he was given 6 additional life terms without the possibility of release. But even then, the story didn't end. Years later, Supreme Court rulings regarding juvenile sentencing forced courts to reconsider whether minors could be sentenced to life without parole. Malvo's case was revisited multiple times, reopening wounds for victims' families. Some argued he had been manipulated and deserved the possibility of redemption. Others insisted that releasing him would dishonor those who were lost. The psychological impact of the attacks lingered long after the shooting stopped. Schools had closed, events were canceled. People remembered exactly where they were when the news broke. For 3 weeks in October 2002, everyday life became a gamble. And when the terror finally ended, the scars remained etched into the memory of an entire region that would never feel quite the same again. But while these attacks came from a distance, Maryland was about to confront something even more disturbing. Because the next predator wasn't hiding in a car. He was hiding in plain sight. Some killers hunt loudly, others vanish into crowds. Hayden Clark belonged to the most disturbing category of all the ones who live quietly among us unnoticed until it's far too late. Clark didn't look like a monster. He drifted from job to job, working as a gardener and handyman across suburban Maryland. He spoke softly. He kept to himself. Neighbors described him as strange but not dangerous, the kind of man people avoided, not feared. That illusion allowed him to operate for years. In the mid-1980 seconds, Clark was staying with his brother in Silver Spring, Maryland. The living arrangement was tense. His brother had grown uncomfortable with Clark's behavior, especially around the children, and told him he needed to leave. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1986, while the family was out, 6-year-old Michelle Dorr wandered over to the house looking for Clark's niece. Her father had left her playing in a small inflatable pool just 2 houses away. When he returned minutes later with sandwiches, Michelle was gone. Panic spread quickly. Neighbors searched. Police were called, but there were no witnesses, no clear leads. What no one knew was that Clark had answered the door. He took Michelle upstairs to a bedroom. There, he ended her life with a knife. He placed her body into a duffel bag and later buried her in a wooded area more than 12 miles away. The case went cold almost immediately. Years passed with no answers. Michelle's father, consumed by grief and guilt, even confessed to the crime himself at one point, desperate to make sense of a loss that had no explanation. Investigators knew his confession didn't match the evidence, but without a suspect, the case remained unsolved. 6 years later, Clark struck again. By 1992, he was working as a gardener for the Hotling family in Bethesda. Penny Hotling had hired him to maintain the yard. Clark became fixated on her, developing an unhealthy attachment that grew more intense over time. When Penny's daughter Laura returned home from college, everything changed. Laura Hotling was 23 years old, a Harvard graduate with her life just beginning. Clark saw her presence as a disruption, an intrusion into the fantasy he had built. One evening after Penny accused Clark of stealing tools, something inside him snapped. Clark returned to the house through a back entrance and went straight to Laura's bedroom. He took her life, wrapped her body in a bedsheet, and carried it through nearby woods to a shallow grave half a mile away. But Clark wasn't finished. The next morning, he returned to the house wearing a wig and women's clothing, mimicking Laura's appearance. A neighbor later reported seeing someone who looked like Laura leaving through the front door. It was a calculated move designed to buy time and delay discovery. It didn't work. Police soon found blood in Laura's bedroom. A pillowcase containing Clark's fingerprints sealed his fate. When officers searched his belongings, they found wigs, women's clothing, and synthetic hair fibers that matched evidence from the scene. Confronted with the mounting proof, Clark confessed. 8 months after Laura's disappearance, he led investigators to her burial site. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For most offenders, that would have been the end of the story. For Hayden Clark, it was just the beginning. While incarcerated, Clark began making strange comments to fellow inmates, hinting that Laura wasn't his only victim. One cellmate, who had long hair and a beard, caught Clark's attention. Clark became convinced he was speaking to a divine figure. Believing he was confessing to a higher power, Clark revealed the truth about Michelle Dorr. Investigators reopened the long cold case. They returned to Clark's brother's former home and tested the floorboards. The results were devastating. Blood evidence matched Michelle's DNA. Clark agreed to lead authorities to Michelle's remains, but only under one condition. He demanded women's clothing. In December 2000, dressed in a wig and skirt, the 47-year-old Clark guided investigators through wooded terrain near Baltimore. There, they found the remains of Michelle Dorr 14 years after she had vanished. Clark was convicted of second-degree responsibility in Michelle's case and received an additional 30-year sentence, bringing his total to 60 years. But even then, the revelations didn't stop. During custody, Clark led investigators to his grandparents' former property. Buried there was a plastic bucket containing more than 200 pieces of jewelry. Among them was Laura Hotling's high school class ring. Clark claimed the remaining items were trophies from other victims, women and children he said he had harmed over decades, including individuals along the East Coast. Without physical evidence or identifiable details, most of those claims could never be confirmed. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosed Clark with paranoid schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. He claimed his crimes were committed by an alter ego, a female persona he called Kristen Bluefin. As if the case wasn't disturbing enough, investigators later learned that Clark's brother, Bradfield, was also incarcerated in California for a similar crime involving dismemberment and cannibalism. The family history was a catalog of dysfunction: an alcoholic mother who dressed Hayden in girls' clothing, an abusive father, and a childhood defined by isolation and cruelty. Today, Hayden Clark remains incarcerated at Western Correctional Institution in Maryland. Former FBI agents who interviewed him described sitting across from someone whose eyes showed nothing, no remorse, no emotion, no humanity. For the families of Michelle Dorr and Laura Hotling, the convictions brought a measure of justice. But justice didn't erase the loss. 2 young lives were stolen by a man who moved through their communities unnoticed, invisible, until it was too late. Clark's story is a chilling reminder that some predators don't hide in shadows. They hide in plain sight. Some crimes aren't just the result of one person's violence. They are the consequence of a system that failed to stop it. On the morning of September 19, 2023, April Hurley was asleep in her basement apartment on Edmondson Avenue in West Baltimore. It was quiet, ordinary, the kind of morning that gives no warning of what's coming. Then came a knock at the door. A man's voice claimed he was maintenance staff. April had no reason to doubt it. She opened the door, and in that instant, her life changed forever. Jason Billingsley forced his way inside. He was 32 years old, recently released from prison, and he never should have been free. Billingsley restrained April and her companion Jonte Gilmore, holding them at gunpoint. What followed was a level of brutality so extreme that first responders would later say they couldn't believe anyone survived it. April was assaulted, beaten her throat, slashed, and then she was set on fire. Jonte was also attacked and left for dead. Neighbors heard the chaos. Flames flickered in the basement window. Acting without hesitation, they broke in and pulled both victims to safety, moments before the fire consumed the space. April was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Against all odds, she lived. Billingsley disappeared into the city. For 5 days, Baltimore held its breath as police searched for a man who had already shown he was capable of unimaginable violence. He moved freely. No one knew where he would strike next. Then, on September 25th, another call came in. Pava Lapere, a 6-year-old tech entrepreneur and Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, had been reported missing by colleagues when she failed to show up for work. She was the founder of a company dedicated to creating opportunities and improving Baltimore's future. Security footage from her apartment building revealed the truth. The video showed Pava entering the lobby late that evening. She sat briefly, then stood and let someone inside. Jason Billingsley. They entered the elevator together. 36 minutes later, Billingsley was seen leaving alone. He wiped his hands on his shorts, removed his sweatshirt, and walked out of the building. Police found Pava on the rooftop of her own apartment building. She had been beaten and strangled. Her life, brilliant, driven, full of promise, was gone. The city erupted in outrage. But the anger didn't stop at the crime itself. Because when investigators examined Billingsley's past, a horrifying truth emerged. This was not unpredictable. In 2015, Billingsley had been convicted of first-degree offenses involving violent forced contact. He received a 30-year sentence, but 16 years were suspended. Maryland's diminution credit system allowed inmates to reduce their sentences for good behavior. As a result, Billingsley was released in 2022 after serving just 9 years. Less than a year later, while still on parole, he committed these attacks. The public demanded answers. How could someone with this history be back on the streets? State's Attorney Ivan Bates addressed the press bluntly. This defendant should have never been released into the community. Billingsley was arrested shortly after Pava's body was discovered. When questioned, he admitted to the crimes. In August 2024, he pleaded guilty to first-degree responsibility in Pava Lapierre's death and 2 counts of attempted killing. The sentencing hearing was raw and emotional. April Hurley stood before the man who had tried to end her life. She spoke about the constant fear she now lives with, the trauma, the flashbacks. If it weren't for God and my will to be alive, she said, I wouldn't be standing here today. Pava's parents also addressed the court. Her father spoke of the milestones his daughter would never reach. Her mother described learning of her death as the moment her body went completely numb. Judge Robert Taylor showed no mercy. He sentenced Billingsley to 3 life terms requiring at least 60 years before any possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. No one in any community will be safe while you are free, the judge said. But even that sentence couldn't undo what had already been lost. Pava's company lost its visionary leader. Baltimore's tech community lost a powerful advocate. April Hurley survived, but with scars that will never fade. The case triggered immediate legislative change. In early 2024, Maryland lawmakers passed the Pava Marie Lapierre Act, eliminating diminution credits for individuals convicted of first-degree violent offenses involving forced contact. Civil lawsuits followed. Hurley and Gilmore sued the property management companies that had employed Billingsley without conducting proper background checks. In late 2024, a jury awarded them $21 million. Billingsley apologized in court, claiming he took responsibility. Pava's father wasn't convinced. This is not a one-time crime, he said. I don't believe this is someone who understands remorse. The Jason Billingsley case isn't just about one man's violence. It's about what happens when warning signs are ignored, when dangerous individuals are released too early, when policy decisions carry human consequences. April Hurley survived something she never should have faced. Pava Lapierre didn't get that chance. And Maryland was forced to confront a brutal truth. Sometimes the system itself becomes part of the crime. In quiet, affluent neighborhoods, danger is supposed to come from outside, from strangers, from somewhere else. In Cockeysville, Maryland, on the night of February 1, 2008, it came from inside the house. Nicholas Browning was 15 years old, a varsity athlete, a Boy Scout, an honor student who built prayer gardens at his church. To teachers, neighbors, and classmates, he looked like a teenager with a bright future and a solid support system. No one suspected what he was planning. That Friday night, Nicholas told his friends he was going to a sleepover. Around midnight, he said he needed to head home briefly to grab his car so they could drive around the neighborhood. It sounded harmless. His friends stayed behind waiting for him to return. But Nicholas didn't go home for his car. He went home to end his family's lives. Earlier that evening, Nicholas had asked his younger brother Gregory to leave the basement door unlocked. Gregory didn't question it. He trusted his older brother. When Nicholas returned, he entered quietly through that door and moved through the unfinished basement toward his destination. His father's handgun. Nicholas found the 9mm firearm, loaded it, and began moving through the house with methodical precision. His first stop was the family room. His father, John Browning, was asleep on the couch. John was a respected attorney, a Boy Scout leader, and by most accounts, a devoted parent. He never woke up. Nicholas stood over him and fired a single shot to the head. Then he went upstairs. His mother, Tamara, was asleep in her bedroom. Nicholas entered without hesitation and ended her life the same way, one shot, clean and deliberate. Next came his younger brothers, Gregory 13, Benjamin 11, the same boys he had grown up with, played with, shared holidays and childhood memories with. He didn't spare them. When it was over, 4 members of the Browning family lay dead in their beds. Nicholas cleaned up just enough to buy himself time. He took the gun, threw it into bushes near the house, and walked back to the sleepover. When his friends asked where he had been, he told them he'd accidentally fallen asleep in his car. The next day, he spent time with friends as if nothing had happened. That evening, Nicholas returned home, this time with people watching. He was the one who walked inside first, the one who discovered his father's body. He ran outside in a panic, screaming for help, playing the role of a shocked and devastated son. Police arrived to a scene of unimaginable horror. At first, investigators weren't sure what they were dealing with. a home invasion, a targeted attack, but as they began interviewing Nicholas and his friends separately, cracks appeared. His timeline didn't line up. His emotional responses felt rehearsed, detached. When pressed, Nicholas broke. He confessed. The details were chilling in their clarity. He described retrieving the gun, moving through the house, pulling the trigger. He claimed he had been driven to it by years of abuse at the hands of his father, physical, emotional, relentless. Prosecutors didn't deny the household was troubled, but they argued something far darker. They said Nicholas didn't want anyone telling him what to do, that he was tired of rules, discipline, and authority, and that he wanted access to his family's inheritance without having to share it with his younger brothers. Letters from relatives painted John Browning as an alcoholic and a harsh parent. Defense psychiatrists testified that Nicholas suffered from dissociative episodes and may have been in a trance-like state during the killings. State experts disagreed, finding no diagnosable mental illness that would explain the level of planning and control. One question haunted everyone involved. Why kill his mother and brothers if his rage was directed at his father? There was no clear answer. In January 2009, Nicholas pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 4 life terms, with 2 to be served consecutively. Under the plea agreement, he would become eligible for parole in 2031 when he turns 39 years old. The sentence shocked the community. How could someone so young with no criminal record commit an act so calculated? His IQ tested at 125. He wasn't struggling academically. He had friends. On the surface, there were no obvious red flags. But prosecutors revealed that months before the murders, Nicholas had told someone on a school bus that he was tired of his father controlling him and that he didn't want to share what would one day be his. This wasn't a moment of blind rage, they argued. It was premeditated. Years later, Nicholas attempted to have his sentence reduced, citing his age at the time of the crime and arguing he deserved rehabilitation rather than permanent incarceration. Prosecutors fought back, emphasizing the brutality and finality of what he had done. The motion was denied. In 2023, the Browning house made headlines again after a different violent incident occurred there, reigniting public fascination with the property. Locals spoke of it as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened. Nicholas remains incarcerated at Western Correctional Institution. His name resurfaces periodically whenever parole eligibility is discussed. Some family members believe he was a victim who snapped. Others see a cold, calculating teenager who viewed his family as obstacles. The truth may lie somewhere in between. 4 lives were erased in a single night, a family destroyed from within, and a community left grappling with the unsettling realization that sometimes the greatest threat isn't a stranger at the door, it's someone you already trust. Revenge doesn't always explode in a moment. Sometimes it ferments slowly, quietly, over years. On the afternoon of June 28, 2018, the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland, was doing what it had done for decades. Reporters typed, editors reviewed copy, phones rang, deadlines loomed. It was an ordinary Thursday, the kind that fades into memory without leaving a mark, until the glass doors shattered. Jared Ramos, 38 years old, stormed into the newsroom carrying a shotgun. He had planned this moment carefully. Smoke grenades to create confusion, extra ammunition to sustain the attack, a deliberate strategy to block exits and trap the people inside. There was no warning. Gunfire erupted through the newsroom. Staff members dove under desks, scrambled for cover, and sent frantic messages to loved ones, unsure if they would survive the next few seconds. In less than a minute, 5 people were gone. Wendy Winters, a 5-year-old community reporter known for her warmth and compassion. John McNamara, a 6-year-old sports journalist nearing retirement. Gerald Fishman, a 1-year-old editorial writer whose words had shaped public debate. Rob Hyacinth, a 9-year-old assistant editor beloved by his colleagues. Rebecca Smith, a 4-year-old sales assistant whose life was just beginning. 2 others were wounded but survived. Every person inside would carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. When police arrived, Ramos made no attempt to escape. He was found hiding under a desk, silent waiting. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. The violence had ended, but the questions were just beginning. Why target a small-town newspaper? The answer stretched back 7 years. In 2011, the Capital Gazette had published an article titled, "Jared Wants to Be Your Friend." The piece detailed Ramos's conviction for misdemeanor harassment after he stalked a former high school classmate through emails, texts, and social media. The reporting was factual, drawn directly from court records. But for Ramos, it was humiliation. He became obsessed with the article, viewing it as a deliberate attempt to destroy his reputation. In 2012, he filed a defamation lawsuit against the newspaper and the reporter. The case was dismissed. He appealed. It was dismissed again. Legally, the matter was over. Emotionally, it was just beginning. For years, Ramos fixated on the Capital Gazette. He monitored staff, filed repeated lawsuits, sent angry messages. He planned the attack, meticulously researching weapons, tactics, and timing. By the time he walked into the newsroom in 2018, this wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of years of obsession. Ramos was charged with 23 criminal counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, but he entered a plea of not criminally responsible, Maryland's version of an insanity defense. His attorneys argued that he suffered from severe delusions and had lost touch with reality. The prosecution told a different story. They showed the jury evidence of detailed planning, the smoke grenades, the barricaded exits, the careful selection of a time when the newsroom would be full. This wasn't confusion or psychosis, they argued. This was revenge. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Survivors testified about hiding under desks, hearing gunshots, watching colleagues fall. Family members of the victims spoke of empty chairs at dinner tables, milestones that would never be reached, futures erased in seconds. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Jared Ramos criminally responsible. On September 28, 2021, Judge Michael Walks delivered the sentence: 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence and 345 years, every sentence running consecutively. Ramos would never be free. The judge didn't soften his words. He described Ramos as remorseless and cold-blooded, noting that Ramos had told a psychiatrist he would harm more people if ever released. Ramos said nothing at sentencing. No apology, no explanation, just silence. But the impact of the attack didn't end in the courtroom. Hours after the shooting, the Capital Gazette staff made a decision that stunned the nation. They announced they would publish the next day. "Yes, we're putting out a damn paper tomorrow," they said. And they did. The paper hit doorsteps the following morning, a defiant statement that journalism would not be silenced by violence. June 28th was later designated Freedom of the Press Day in Maryland. A memorial with 5 stone pillars now stands in Annapolis, each representing a life lost. For survivors, healing has been slow and uneven. One photojournalist later said that introducing himself became painful because his presence reminded people of what had happened. The case reignited national conversations about threats against journalists, warning signs that go unaddressed, and how obsession can escalate when left unchecked. Jared Ramos remains in prison, where he will die. The Capital Gazette continues to publish. And the newsroom shooting stands as a stark reminder: sometimes hatred doesn't arrive shouting. It arrives after years of silence, lawsuits, and resentment, until one day, words are no longer enough. Valentine's Day weekend is supposed to be about closeness, about romance, about trust. In February 1998, Kimberly and Stephen Rico checked into a charming resort on Maryland's Eastern Shore for what was advertised as a light-hearted murder mystery dinner weekend. Couples dressed up, actors played roles, guests laughed while pretending to solve a fictional crime over food and wine. For everyone else, the murder was pretend. For Stephen Rico, it was real. To friends and family, Kimberly and Stephen looked like a normal married couple. Stephen worked in sales. Kimberly was a surgical technician, trained, trusted, and with regular access to hospital equipment and powerful medications. Their marriage, however, was quietly unraveling. Kimberly had been having an affair with a volunteer firefighter she met through work. The relationship had grown serious enough that she wanted out of her marriage, but divorce came with complications, shared assets, legal battles, and the loss of financial security. Kimberly saw another way. On the night of February 14th, after the murder mystery festivities ended, the couple returned to their hotel room. Stephen had been drinking and was exhausted. He went to bed unaware that his wife had brought something with her: a vial of succinylcholine. It's a paralytic drug commonly used in medical settings to stop muscle movement during surgery. In the right dose, it causes complete paralysis, including the muscles responsible for breathing. The victim remains conscious, but unable to move, speak, or cry out. Prosecutors later argued that Kimberly administered the drug while Stephen slept. Once he was immobilized and helpless, she set the room on fire. The plan was calculated. Make it look like a tragic accident, a heater malfunction, a cigarette, a careless mistake after a night of drinking. Kimberly would escape unharmed, collect more than $400, 0 life insurance, and begin a new life with her lover. But the fire told a different story. When firefighters arrived, they noticed burn patterns that didn't match an accidental blaze. The fire was concentrated, controlled, staged. Investigators also realized something more disturbing. Stephen had already passed away before the fire began. Smoke inhalation wasn't the cause. An autopsy was ordered. Toxicology results came back positive for succinylcholine. That finding immediately narrowed the suspect pool. The drug isn't recreational. It isn't easily accessible. It's used in hospitals, places where Kimberly Rico worked every day. Detectives dug deeper. They uncovered the affair, the financial motive, the life insurance policies. Co-workers confirmed Kimberly had access to the drug and the knowledge to use it. Resort staff recalled her behavior after the fire calm, composed, detached, not the reaction of someone who had just lost their spouse in a sudden tragedy. The case went to trial in 1999. Prosecutors walked the jury through the science, how succinylcholine works, how quickly it acts, how difficult it can be to detect if investigators aren't looking for it. They explained how the fire had been used as a smokescreen, literally and figuratively. The defense argued the case was circumstantial. There was no witness who saw Kimberly administer the drug, no video, no confession. They claimed the toxicology evidence could be misinterpreted and suggested alternative explanations for Stephen's condition. But the totality of the evidence told a single consistent story. Motive, means, opportunity. The jury wasn't convinced by Kimberly's explanations. They found her guilty of first-degree murder and arson. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, with the sentences running concurrently. The case later became the subject of a Forensic Files episode titled Murder on the Menu, highlighting how medical knowledge can be weaponized in ways that are nearly invisible until it's too late. Stephen Rico's family described him as kind and hardworking, a man who trusted his wife completely. He had gone away for a romantic weekend and never returned. Kimberly maintained her innocence, filing appeals, and claiming succinylcholine degrades too quickly to be reliable evidence. Courts consistently rejected her arguments. Hospitals across the country reviewed and tightened protocols around controlled substances. The case became a cautionary tale about access, trust, and how expertise can be turned lethal. Today, Kimberly Rico remains incarcerated at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup. The life insurance payout she planned for was denied. The future she imagined never came. The murder mystery weekend ended with a real crime, one solved not by a script, but by forensic science persistence, and the truth that no plan is ever as perfect as the person who designs it believes. Some cases end with answers. This one never did. On September 7, 2014, Montgomery County, Maryland, Catherine Hoggle arrived at her estranged husband Troy Turner's home to pick up their two youngest children, 3-year-old Sarah and 2-year-old Jacob. She said she was taking them out for pizza. A short trip, nothing unusual. Despite their separation and Catherine's well-documented struggles with mental health, Troy had no reason to refuse. She was still their mother. The children left with her that afternoon. They never came home. Hours passed. Then night fell. Catherine returned alone. When Troy asked where Sarah and Jacob were, her answers didn't make sense. First she said they were with a friend, then a daycare, then relatives. Each explanation collapsed under basic scrutiny. Police were called. Search efforts began immediately. Officers questioned Catherine again and again, pressing for clear answers. Instead, they received contradictions, fragmented stories, and statements that drifted in and out of reality. At times, she implied the children were safe. At other moments, she hinted at something far darker. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a typical missing children case. They were dealing with a mother in the grip of severe mental illness. Catherine Hoggle was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that distorts perception, memory, and judgment. Her mental state had been deteriorating for years. By the time Sarah and Jacob disappeared, she was deeply delusional. Still, the urgency remained. 2 toddlers were missing. Massive search operations were launched. Volunteers combed parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned from above. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Dive teams searched bodies of water. Billboards went up across the region, showing Sarah and Jacob's faces, pleading for information. Nothing. No bodies. No credible sightings. No physical evidence. The children had vanished. Catherine was arrested and charged with 2 counts related to their disappearance and parental abduction. But the case stalled almost immediately. Under Maryland law, a defendant must be mentally competent to stand trial, able to understand the charges and assist in their defense. Catherine could do neither. She was placed in a maximum security psychiatric hospital. Doctors worked to stabilize her condition, hoping she could eventually participate in legal proceedings. Year after year, evaluations came back the same. Incompetent. Maryland law sets limits on how long someone can be held without trial. Normally, after 5 years, charges must be dismissed or alternatives considered. But this case was different. 2 children were missing. The stakes were too high. Judges repeatedly extended her confinement. Prosecutors argued that releasing her without answers would be unthinkable. Defense attorneys argued that indefinite detention violated constitutional rights. The system stalled, trapped between justice and legality. Meanwhile, Troy Turner waited. He gave interviews. He begged the public for information. He kept searching. He spoke openly about the agony of not knowing. If his children were gone, he wanted to grieve. If they were alive, he wanted to find them. Living in uncertainty, he said, was the worst form of torture. Public debate intensified. Some believed Catherine knew exactly what had happened, but refused or was unable to reveal it. Others believed her illness had fractured her memory so completely that the truth was lost even to her. Mental health advocates raised concerns about holding someone indefinitely without trial. Families of missing children demanded answers. Years passed. As of 2025, Catherine Hoggle remains in psychiatric custody, still deemed incompetent to stand trial. Sarah and Jacob are still listed as missing. Active search efforts have largely ceased. The case remains open, but time has worked against it. If the children were alive, they would now be teenagers. Their faces, frozen at ages 3 and 2, remain on missing person posters unchanged while the world moves forward without them. No graves to visit, no answers to cling to, just silence. The Catherine Hoggle case is one of Maryland's most haunting mysteries, not only because of what may have happened, but because the truth may never be known. It exposed deep cracks in how the legal system handles mental illness, accountability, and unresolved harm. 2 children vanished on an ordinary Sunday. Their mother remains confined. And the truth, whatever it is, remains locked away, possibly forever. For 4 days in March 2000, an entire Maryland suburb lived in fear. Streets were sealed, homes were evacuated, television cameras broadcast live as armored vehicles rolled into position. Inside, a single house lives hung in the balance hour after hour, night after night. At the center of it all was Joseph Palczynski. He was 31 years old, volatile, and deeply unstable. Friends and former partners described him as charming one moment and terrifying the next. He had a documented history of domestic violence, restraining orders, and untreated bipolar disorder. Law enforcement knew his name, but knowing didn't mean stopping. His obsession was a young woman named Tracy Whitehead. Tracy had dated Palczynski briefly before recognizing the danger and ending the relationship. She obtained a restraining order. She tried to disappear from his life. It didn't work. Palczynski refused to let go. He stalked her, threatened her, made it clear that if he couldn't have her, no one would. On March 7, 2000, the obsession turned deadly. Palczynski drove to the home of Tracy's former boyfriend, George Shanks, where George lived with his mother, Gloria. Armed and enraged, Palczynski forced his way inside and opened fire. Both George and Gloria were killed. From there, he tracked down another man connected to Tracy David Myers and took his life as well. 3 people were gone before the manhunt even began. Palczynski abducted Tracy and vanished. For days, he moved across Maryland and into Virginia, staying ahead of police while keeping Tracy captive. She later described living in constant terror, never knowing if she would survive the next hour. 10 days later, Palczynski made a decision that would turn a private nightmare into a public spectacle. He drove Tracy to her family's home in Dundalk, a working-class neighborhood near Baltimore. Inside were Tracy's parents and her brother. Palczynski forced his way in at gunpoint, taking all 4 hostage. He barricaded doors, covered windows, and made it clear he was prepared to die. Police surrounded the house. Negotiators attempted contact, Palczynski's demands shifted constantly: safe passage, media attention, impossible conditions. He ranted, he paced, he aimed his weapon at the people he claimed to love. Inside, the hostages endured psychological torture, unsure if the next sound would be a gunshot. The standoff dragged on, hour after hour, day after day. For 97 hours, the community watched live broadcasts as negotiators tried to talk Palczynski down. Children were kept home from school, residents sheltered in place. Helicopters thudded overhead through the night. Inside the house, Tracy's family noticed something crucial. Palczynski's behavior changed when he took certain medications. At one point, they convinced him to take Xanax, telling him it would help calm his nerves. Exhausted, paranoid, and emotionally frayed, he agreed. The drug took effect slowly. His grip loosened. His focus drifted. In a carefully coordinated moment, the hostages ran. Tracy, her mother, and her brother bolted through the door screaming as they fled toward police lines. Officers rushed forward, pulling them to safety. Tracy's father escaped moments later from another part of the house. Palczynski realized what had happened. Armed and advancing, he moved toward the exit. Police made the call. Officers opened fire simultaneously. Ballistics later confirmed Palczynski was struck 27 times. He collapsed on the lawn and was pronounced dead at the scene. The standoff was over. But the questions were just beginning. How had a man with such a violent history been able to escalate to this point? Why hadn't restraining orders stopped him? Why hadn't his untreated mental illness triggered stronger intervention before 3 people were killed? Investigators later confirmed Palczynski had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder years earlier, but had stopped taking prescribed medication. He believed it weakened him. Instead, he self-medicated, fueling paranoia and rage. The case exposed painful gaps in how the justice system handles domestic violence and mental health crises. Warning signs had been everywhere. Threats, stalking, restraining orders, prior arrests, but no single mechanism existed to stop him before he reached this breaking point. For Tracy Whitehead, survival came at an unimaginable cost. 3 people lost their lives because of someone's obsession with her. She spent days as a hostage, unsure if she would ever be free. In the years that followed, she spoke publicly about domestic violence, urging others to take threats seriously and seek help early. The Dundalk neighborhood never forgot. For 4 days, their streets had been a battlefield. The house became infamous. Even after it changed hands, the memory lingered of flashing lights, armed officers, and the sound of helicopters overhead. Joseph Palczynski's story is a grim reminder that standoffs are often the final chapter of a failure that began long before. By the time negotiations start, the damage is already done. And while this case ended in gunfire on a quiet lawn, the next one would never truly end at all. Because Maryland's final case isn't remembered for certainty. It's remembered for doubt. Some cases end with a verdict. This one became a question the world couldn't stop asking. On January 13, 1999, Hae Min Lee, a bright, popular 18-year-old high school senior from Baltimore, vanished after school. She was supposed to pick up her younger cousin from daycare, something she never missed. She never arrived. By that evening, her family was frantic. By the next morning, a missing person report was filed. 5 weeks later, on February 9th, her body was discovered in Leakin Park, a wooded area in West Baltimore known for its isolation. She had been strangled and partially buried beneath leaves and debris. The investigation moved fast. Detectives interviewed friends, classmates, and family members from Woodlawn High School. One name kept resurfacing: Adnan Syed Hay's ex-boyfriend. They had broken up just weeks earlier in December 1998. Friends described the relationship as intense, but typical: young, emotional, and brief. Prosecutors would later argue that Adnan didn't take the breakup well. On February 28, 1999, Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was 17 years old. The state's case relied heavily on one witness, Jay Wilds, a classmate who claimed Adnan had confessed to killing Hae and that he had helped bury the body. Jay's story shifted multiple times during police interviews, but the core accusation remained. Prosecutors also presented cell phone records, arguing they placed Adnan near Leakin Park on the day of the murder. Together, they said, the testimony, timeline, and motive painted a clear picture. The defense disagreed. They argued the case was circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking Adnan to the crime scene. Jay's statements were inconsistent. And a potential alibi witness, Asia McLean, claimed she had seen Adnan at the public library during the critical time window, but she was never called to testify. In February 2000, a jury found Adnan Syed guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. For Hae Min Lee's family, the verdict brought closure. For Adnan's family, it marked the beginning of a decades-long fight they believed was built on a wrongful conviction. For years, the case faded into obscurity. Then, in 2014, everything changed. A journalist named Sarah Koenig launched a podcast called Serial. Over 12 episodes, she revisited the case, interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, and openly questioning whether justice had truly been served. The podcast didn't declare Adnan innocent or guilty. It asked uncomfortable questions. The response was unprecedented. Serial became the most downloaded podcast in history, surpassing 300 million downloads. It reignited national conversations about wrongful convictions, unreliable witnesses, and how much certainty is enough to put someone away for life. Experts challenged the cell phone evidence. Jay's credibility was dissected. The defense attorney's health during trial was scrutinized. Public opinion fractured. In 2016, a judge granted Adnan a new trial, citing ineffective assistance of counsel. The state appealed. Years of legal back and forth followed. Supporters rallied. Documentaries were produced. The case became a cultural phenomenon. Then in September 2022, a stunning development. Prosecutors filed a motion to vacate Adnan's conviction, citing newly discovered evidence, including alternative suspects who had never been fully investigated. A judge agreed. After 23 years in prison, Adnan Syed walked free. For some, it was vindication. For Hae Min Lee's family, it felt like justice being ripped away. The chaos wasn't over. In March 2023, an appellate court reinstated Adnan's conviction on procedural grounds, ruling that Hae's family hadn't been properly notified of the motion to vacate. However, Adnan was resentenced to time served, allowing him to remain free while legal battles continued. As of today, Adnan Syed is not behind bars, but his conviction still technically stands. The case exists in legal limbo. If Adnan didn't kill Hae Min Lee, then who did? That question remains unanswered. Hae Min Lee was a young woman with plans, friendships, and a future that never arrived. Her life ended on a cold January day in 1999, and more than 2 decades later, there is still no resolution everyone can agree on. The Adnan Syed case has become a symbol not just of a single crime, but of the complexity of justice itself, of how evidence, memory, and narrative can shift over time, of how the truth can become harder to reach the longer a case lives in the public eye. Maryland's darkest chapters don't close with certainty. They close with questions. And sometimes, those questions are all that remain. 10 cases. 10 different paths into darkness. Yet every one of them leads to the same place. Maryland is often remembered for its historic streets, waterfront views, and quiet suburban neighborhoods. But beneath that familiar surface exists another reality, one shaped by violence, failure, obsession, and unanswered questions. These cases were not anomalies, they were warnings. Some of these stories showed us what happens when cruelty is deliberate and calculated. Others revealed how easily danger can grow when warning signs are ignored. In several, the system designed to protect people arrived too late or failed entirely. And in the most haunting cases, justice never truly arrived at all. What connects all of them is not just the crimes themselves, but the aftermath. Families left searching for meaning where none exists. Communities forever altered by moments they wish they could erase. Survivors carrying memories that don't fade with time. And victims whose names are now spoken not by loved ones, but by investigators, journalists, and strangers trying to understand what went wrong. True crime is never just about what happened. It's about what it reveals. It reveals how ordinary settings can become crime scenes, how trust can be weaponized, how systems can crack under pressure, and how the line between safety and tragedy is often thinner than anyone wants to believe. For some of these cases, the courts delivered sentences that closed a chapter. For others, appeals, mental illness, or missing evidence ensured that closure would never come. Justice, as these stories remind us, is not always clean, it is not always final, and it is not always fair. But remembering these cases matters, not because of fascination with violence, but because every name in these stories belonged to a real person, someone who laughed, planned, hoped, and trusted, someone whose life mattered long before it became a headline. When the headlines fade, and the cameras turn away, the consequences remain. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: these stories are not confined to the past. They are reminders that vigilance, accountability, and compassion are not optional. They are necessary because the next story is always waiting to be written. The cases end here, but their echoes do not.